This morning, I'd like to talk to you about how to stay calm in the storm. Last week, we talked about how to make the most of the storm, right? How the storm could be an incredible opportunity for God to work in. The storm can be an incredible time for God to move in. That in the storm, oftentimes there's open doors that God only has opened during the storm. But today I want to talk about how we can stay calm in the storm. As I was preparing this sermon, I thought about a time when I was in high school and I went to Dick's Sporting Goods with my family. And in Dick's Sporting Goods, they have, in the back of the store, they have 2 floors. And they used to have this huge 2-store rock climbing wall. And so me and my family went. We were, buying some sports clothes. And we showed up here, and my dad said, hey, what if you do the rock climbing wall? And I said, okay. And for a moment there, after I said, okay, I started to think, what in the world did I get myself into? I forgot I'm afraid of heights. So I got on this. They strap you up. They tell you there's no chance you're going to fall and start climbing this wall. And for about the first half of the wall, the first story, I was climbing it pretty well. There was no challenges, no big problems. I'm a decent rock climber. I feel like I'm Spider-Man for the first half. And once I got past the first story, I started to feel my body start to shake a little bit. I started to feel like I was a little bit slower to grab the next rock. And I was kind of like wondering, what in the world is going on? I was flying through the easy part. But as I got further and further and further up the wall, what I realized is that my fear was kicking in. And there's a logical aspect and part of myself that knows I'm not going to get hurt. There's nice soft cushion if I fall. I'm strapped in. There's a professional helping me climb. But how many of us know that oftentimes logic can't set aside fear? Sometimes our emotions can overwhelm our logic and seem bigger than our logic. And so although in my mind I was telling myself, you're not going to get hurt, my fear was saying, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get hurt. You're going to be the person that for whatever reason, the cord's going to snap on you. And there was this fear. And so I got to a point where I was just frozen there I was maybe, 4, 5, 6 feet away from finishing the wall, frozen there, shaking on the wall. And my dad, who was about parallel on the second floor, said, Josiah, you could finish it. And I'm looking up, thinking, nope, I can't finish that. And I'm looking up at the top. I mean, I could see and touch that it's not even that much further away. And my dad keeps telling me, you're good. Keep pushing. You're okay. Just do a couple of 1 stone at a time. And I was just paralyzed by fear. But as my dad continued to encourage me, I took 1 stone at a time, my body still shaking, sweating from the top to the bottom, just like, I just want this to be over. I even said at one point, can you just let me back down? I'm ready for this to be over. But with the encouragement of my dad, somebody speaking into my life, keep going, you can finish this, I was able to overcome my fear. In this storm, this crisis, this time that we live in today, where this virus has really spread and become a pandemic and spread all over the world, I see so many people gripped by fear. What's going to happen next? Am I going to get the virus? What if my kids get it? Real fears, right? Like, I lost my job. How am I going to be able to pay my mortgage? And, school's out. Am I going to be able to do okay online? I'm not great at that. And there's real fears in this time that people are gripped by, sometimes paralyzed by, and even I've seen it in some Christians and believers around me. I don't know if you guys have seen this too, some of the craziness, but there's been fights, right? People are so afraid. There's been fights over gas and fights over toilet paper, fights over water. And there comes a point where fear can overwhelm us and overtake us, or we can choose to live out of the faith and the trust that we have in Jesus. I want to turn to a passage in the Bible, really powerful passage. A passage in Luke chapter 8 that talks about the disciples, Jesus' followers, going through a storm. A storm that was dangerous, a storm that they were scared of, a storm that they could have died to, and Jesus teaches them a lesson in the middle of the storm that really allows them to live their life in a completely different way. So if you have your Bibles this morning, it should be on the screen as well. If you can, some of you guys have your old school hard King James Bibles. If not, you could turn on your phone. But turn with me to Luke chapter 8, verse 22 through 25. Luke 8 says this: One day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and they set out. If you're taking notes this morning, 3 key ideas that I want to give to you if you're right now in the middle of this storm and you feel overwhelmed, you feel fearful, you feel full of anxiety or stress. I want you to hear the truth of the Word of God and be able to walk out of this with a calm and a peace in your spirit. Number 1, write this down if you want to stay calm in a crisis. Remember, storms are part of life. Storms are part of life. Oftentimes, we go through a storm. And that doesn't have to be a virus. That could be a storm of a marriage that seems rocky. It can be losing a job that just feels like you're in this storm. Like, how are you going to get through this season? Sometimes it's a storm of anxiety, and it just seems like you just are always carrying a weight on your shoulders and you're overwhelmed. But storms are a part of life. And let me say this, sometimes some of the storms that come into our life are because we make dumb decisions, right? Some storms come into our life because we make silly choices. Some storms even come into our life because we're disobedient. Think about Jonah for a moment. Jonah ran from God, and what happened? The Lord put Jonah in a storm. Some storms come out of disobedience. Hey, some people are in a storm of a relationship simply because they chose someone that they shouldn't have been with. But other storms in life, and this is what struck me from the passage, other storms in life that we go through, sometimes they're from obeying God. Think about this thought for a moment. Sometimes the storm that we go through is a storm that God has actually led us into. Listen to this passage one more time. One day Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." It wasn't the disciples' idea to go on this little trip across the lake. It was Jesus' idea. And Jesus, being God, knew that they would go into a storm. So think about that for a moment. The reason that the disciples were in a storm is because Jesus led the disciples into a storm. Sometimes God will lead us into a storm because he wants to test our faith. He wants to grow you spiritually. He wants to bring you to the next level. And there's some growth in your life and in your spiritual walk that only will come through being in the storm. You want to start praying a dangerous prayer? Start praying that God would bring a storm into your life. Some of us have prayed, "God, would you grow me? Would you mature me? Would you bring me to the next level in my faith, Jesus?" And he brings a storm into your life and you say, "God, why the storm?" And God's saying, "Don't you remember that you asked to go to the next level, and I brought that storm into your life because I know that he knew that there was going to be nothing else that was going to push you to that next level faster than a storm in your life." I think one of the things that helps us in the middle of a storm or a crisis, when the storm comes, because it will, is remembering that this is part of life. Life's not meant to be easy. And, as we came to Christ and started walking with Jesus, he never promised us a life without troubles. In John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus actually promises the opposite. Think about this. Jesus says, actually, you will have trouble. In this life, you will have storms. In this life, you will have times where you say, I don't want to be in this crisis, but the truth is that God can use the storm and the crisis in our life to bring us to levels in our faith and our trusting of Jesus that we've never been to before. I talked to a young lady in part of our community. A young lady who's been walking with Jesus, man, has a radical transformation story. And she was telling me as she works at restaurants, she told me that she lost her restaurant job. And she said, I don't know how I'm going to get through this season. I lost my source of income. I'm nervous and I'm concerned. And I was talking to her and I said, God will help you get through this season. I know he will. And she told me this. She looked me in the eye and she said this. She said, I know he will, because he's taken me through other seasons in the past that I thought were impossible, and he's brought me through those, and he's always provided for me. So she said, she was saying this. She said, I thought about not even giving my offering because I got paid this week because I was nervous, but you know what? God has always provided. So I looked back on the past experiences and remembered, Jesus, you will always provide in the hard times. I will trust you in this storm because I've trusted you in the last one. See, when we remember that storms are a part of life, it helps us to remember that storms come and go as well. Hey, can I tell you, this coronavirus that's bad, and it is bad, and it's serious, and it's spreading, and there's constant news of, the country tolls that are going up, and how there's not enough test kits and how we're behind and what's going to happen. There's constant news of what's going to happen and how our world's going to change. But let me just pause, stop you, and remind you of this. This storm will pass as well. And sometimes when you're in the storm, it feels like the storm's never going to end. But let me just calm you, remind you that this storm will pass. That we're going to look back one day and say, hey, you remember that the virus? You remember how challenging that was? That time will pass. And so in the middle of the storm, if we want to keep our calm, if we want to keep our peace, we need to remember that storms are a part of life. And let me just put one more little nugget in there before we move to the second point. Jesus was with them in the middle of the storm. Sometimes the storm seems overwhelming, but let me remind you, Jesus has not abandoned you. Jesus is not unaware of your problems. Jesus is not unaware of the financial burdens you're going through right now. Jesus is well aware of the storm, and guess what? He's right there with you. Just because the storm hasn't changed doesn't mean that Jesus isn't with you. He's with you, even in the middle of the storm. Number two, if we want to stay calm in the middle of this crisis, we need to remember to live in the present. Listen to verse 23 and 24. As they sailed, Jesus fell asleep. A squall or storm came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. Listen to verse 24. The disciples went and woke Jesus, saying, Master, we're going to drown. He got up and rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided and all was calm. The storm is raging. This storm was not a little thing, right? The passage doesn't say that the disciples made the storm bigger than it was. No, the storm was what the passage says is a great danger. I don't know if you've ever been on the ocean or a lake. Typically, we don't get too bad of storms on lakes. But if you've ever been on like a big body of water in the middle of a storm, man, it is a scary, scary thing. You feel so small amongst the waves. If the boat's rocking, you feel kind of like, wow, I'm just a little ant here. And the waves can feel so huge and overwhelming. And these disciples that were with Jesus, some of them were advanced, seasoned fishermen, right? They weren't like, oh yeah, they had seen the water, been on the water, experienced some things, and yet they were afraid, scared. And it says they were in great danger as these waves swamped and started filling up the boat. And at the whole time, where's Jesus? Jesus is taking a nap. Jesus is tired. He's taking a nap. Well, everyone's freaking out on the boat. Jesus is just kind of taking a nap. And so the disciples wake him up. And their response is, Master, Master, we're going to drown. Let me say this. In the middle of our storm, what often happens is our fear takes over and pushes us to overreact. You ever have an ache or a pain somewhere that's a new pain? Maybe you got a little pain in your side right here. You worked out too hard the night before, right? You were doing those ab crunches, getting ready for the summertime. And you got a little pain here because you worked out too hard, but you go, I've never felt that pain before in my life. What is that? And how many of us, if we're honest, we've done the worst possible thing that we could ever do? We go on WebMD and we say, what is this little pain to my right over here? Feeling pain to the right above the hip, what is that? And no one ever in their life has gone on WebMD and said, oh, no, I'm okay, I'm fine. You go on WebMD and you start thinking the worst. There could be cancer in that spot. It could be this. It could be that. It could be my pancreas. Well, what if I go down? What if that means it's spread and I won't see my next birthday and I'll be stuck in a house, lose my hair. And you start like building this whole thing, this whole story of what could happen with this little pain that really it was just you working out and you worked out a little bit too hard. And what happens is fear pushes us to overreact. Fear pushes us to think the worst is going to happen. And it goes from a little feeling in a little pain in your side to thinking that your life's going to end when you don't even know what that is. And it's often that way we go through a storm like this and we lose our job or something like that, which is a challenging thing to go through. But we start going, oh, I lost my job and now my kids aren't going to eat. I'm going to lose the house and I'm going to lose the house. And then I'm going to get into debt and then I'll be stuck in that debt forever. And we start playing out the worst case scenario. We start making the future as dark as possible. And we start just living in our mind in the future of what could happen, what could happen, what could happen. Fear pushes you to think the worst about the future. And what I love is that hope is completely the opposite. Walking with Jesus and having hope helps you believe the best for the future. And so if we want to stay calm in the middle of a crisis or storm, we need to live in the present. The disciples were living out of fear. And think about this for a moment. The disciples come up to Jesus, the creator of the world, and they tell him, the one who knows the future, what's going to happen. How silly is that? Jesus, Master, we're going to drown. The disciples were telling Jesus what was going to happen next. How silly is that? And yet sometimes we do the same thing with Jesus. Jesus, this is what's going to happen. My life's going to unravel. Do this, save me. And Jesus is like, listen. You're in the boat with me. You're okay. I'm in the boat. Why are you worrying and fearing about the future when I'm in control? Why are you thinking the worst case scenario is going to happen when I'm on the boat with you? Why is your mind going to the worst place that it can possibly go to? And the reality is that when our faith is distracted, it always leads to an overreaction. When our faith and our trust in Jesus becomes distracted by the storm, we always overreact and think the worst is going to happen because we've taken our eyes off the one who is in control. And it's so easy to allow fear to determine our response instead of allowing faith to determine our response. And that's why you see people running to the stores, fighting over gasoline with people, fighting over toilet paper, stocking up crazy amounts because they're allowing their fear to lead them to a response instead of allowing their faith to lead them to a response. When we have our faith in Jesus, it changes everything that we do. And let me tell you this, when you have your faith in Jesus, it changes the way you think about the situation. When you have your faith in Jesus, it changes the way you think about the future. When you have your faith in Jesus, it forces you to think, hey, it might be bad now, but I'm believing and trusting, and I have hope from God to believe for a better future. I looked in somebody's eyes a couple weeks ago. A man who had lost his job, lost his family, his kids didn't want to talk to him, and he had lost hope. Going through a tough season. And I looked him in the eyes and I said this. I said, your best days are still in front of you. And he started crying. Tears streaming down his face. And I just wanted to encourage him. I just spoke into his eyes. I said, listen, I know you feel like your best days are behind you, but your best days are in front of you. God still has amazing things he can do with your life. Don't allow the enemy to rob you of your future because you're looking back at what you lost, the regrets, the pain. Start looking forward. Hope allows you, when you have hope in your life, it allows you to start moving forward. It allows you to start looking forward. But if you're always afraid, then you're unable to see what's next. Jesus' disciples had walked with him. They had seen his power. They had seen him move. But their faith was not where it was needed to be. And when they encounter Jesus, they wake him up and they tell him that their future is doomed. We're going to drown. And Jesus, you know some Bible scenes you just kind of wish you could see? Some Bible scenes you just wish, like, I just wish I was there to be able to see that scene. And it says that Jesus got up, rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided and everything was calm. And this is what he says next. Jesus says to these disciples, where is your faith? Where is your faith? In other words, where is your trust in me? What happened to you trusting in me? See, I think the greatest test of our faith is not on the mountaintop, but it's in the valley low. The greatest test of our faith is not when we have success, it's when we have loss. The greatest test of our faith is not when we have everything, it's when we've lost everything. The greatest test of our faith is when we don't know what's going to happen in the future and it looks dark, but we choose to believe in Jesus and trust in him, and he brings us through it. There's something that happens when we say, you know what, Jesus, I don't know what's going to happen to tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen next week or next year, but you know what? I trust in you because you're in control and you're powerful and you care about me. See, the problem is we start forgetting about who we are in God's eyes. You're not just some stranger to God. You're not some foreigner. You're his child. You're part of his family. He takes care of his family. Jesus says, where is your faith? He asked his disciples. In fear and amazement, they asked one another, who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. Third and last point is this: if you want to stay calm in the middle of the storm and the crisis, you need to remember who is in control. I've seen people, I have family members, people around me who are just unraveling, who are so afraid, they're stocking up, they're doing this. It's just so terrifying. And I'm not saying don't take precautions, right? Take precautions, be wise, be smart. But they're just all over the place. Totally overwhelmed by fear and what could happen and what if this and what if the government shuts down, and just all these playing out all these possible scenarios that might happen but might not. And I see so many people overwhelmed by the storm. And can I tell you, for us as Christians, can I tell you, for me as a believer, I don't know what next week has in store or next month has in store. But let me tell you this, I know who's in control next week, next month, next year, in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now, in 1,000 years from now. I still know who is in control, and it's Jesus. And it's interesting to me that one of the things that damages our faith and hurts us is when we forget who Jesus is. Jesus says, "Where is your faith?" And in fear and amazement, they ask one another this question: who is this? See, in the middle of the storm, the greatest danger that can happen to us is we could forget who Jesus is. The greatest challenge in the storm, is that the storm can try to rob us of the reality of who Jesus is. The disciples needed to be reminded in this storm who Jesus was. And they looked to one another in the middle of the storm, where they were so overwhelmed by everything that was going on, and they look to one another and they see the power of Jesus, and they look to one another and they go, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Who is this? That even creation bows to him and obeys him. Who is this?" See, they had forgotten the power of Jesus. They had forgotten who sits on the throne. They had forgotten who is in control. They had forgotten that Jesus is all powerful, that Jesus is the King of all kings and the Lord of all lords. And when we forget who's in control, we feel out of control. When we forget that Jesus holds and sustains the universe, Colossians says that Jesus is actively holding and sustaining the universe together. Think about that for a moment. That Jesus was not just there to create the universe, but Jesus sustains the universe. So if Jesus can sustain the universe, tell me he can't sustain your life. If Jesus can sustain the universe, tell me he can't sustain your marriage when it's going through the worst season. If Jesus can sustain the stars and the planets all in his hand, he can hold it all together in every moment, every second. How can we not trust him when we go through a storm that's so much smaller than the universe? You know, through this, I'm watching the same news that you're watching, hearing the same reports, the same fears, breaking news, and it's so easy for our faith to get smaller. So easy for us to join in the panic and get overwhelmed. It's so easy for us to lose sight of who Jesus is because we're focused on the waves and the wind. It's so easy to get overwhelmed and to feel out of control when you forget who's in control. The disciples needed to be reminded of the power of Jesus. They needed to be reminded in the middle of the storm, the power and the control that Jesus has. And as we go through this storm, not knowing when it's going to end, not knowing when the vaccine is going to be created, tested, and ready, not knowing how low the economy will dip, not knowing the future, not knowing what's going to happen next. I want to challenge you as a follower of Jesus. Don't feel overwhelmed. Don't feel stressed out. Remember who's in control. And when you feel overwhelmed, when you feel stressed, when you feel like the world is on your shoulders, I want to challenge you to go through the Bible and to remember who's in control. I want you to go through the Bible, and maybe you need to read a story like this where there was a storm that threatened to end their life, and yet Jesus calmed the storm because he was over the wind and the waves. As you go through this storm and as we go through it together, I want to challenge you when your faith is tested and you feel stretched and you don't feel like, hey, I don't know if I can get out of the bed this morning because I have so much anxiety over what's going to happen in the future. Let me remind you, you might not know the future, but he does. The coronavirus didn't take him by surprise. Jesus is in control before, middle, and after the virus. He sits on the throne, full of power, sustaining the universe. And as we feel the wind and the waves and we look at the boat feeling like we're in great danger, don't cry out to God filled with fear and assuming the future. Cry out to God with a sense and a trust and a faith saying, God, you put me in this boat. You said we're getting to the other side and you are in control. I believe that God is going to take you through this season and he's going to grow your faith. I believe that there's going to be a lot of us that are going to go through this season that our faith is being stretched. We're being challenged. Maybe even we've started off bad and our response has been one of being worried all the time and overreacting to things because we're just overwhelmed. But I want to challenge you that as the weeks go on, to put your trust and your faith in him who's over the wind and who's over the waves and who's in control every single minute of every second. He knows what's going on in your life. He's aware of it. He knows the storm. He knows the challenges. He knows what you're lacking, and he cares about you. He's gonna provide for you and care for you, and he could give you everything that you need because he's all powerful and he's in control. I want you to walk through this storm just like me, with a peace in your heart that you didn't have before, with a calmness in your heart that you didn't have before, and a sense that, hey, I don't know what's gonna happen tomorrow, but I'm gonna trust Jesus today, that his power, that his magnificence, that his glory is gonna be shining in this moment, and that my faith is gonna go to a whole nother level because I trusted in him in the middle of the storm, and I could take on the next storm and the storm after that and the storm after that because his power was shown to me, and I saw the one who was in control.